Hello, everyone. My name is Anne Marie Adams, and as chair of the Department of Social Studies of Medicine at McGill University, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual event, Perspectives on Sir William Osler in the 21st Century. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us. We have a full program for you this afternoon, or day, or evening, as we have many participants from overseas. And while we may not be physically on campus today, I'd like to acknowledge that McGill University is located on land which has long served as a site of the meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. We are so pleased that Dr. David Eidelman, Vice Principal Health Affairs and Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at McGill, is able to join us today. I would now like to invite Dr. Eidelman to say a few words to start our event.
Thank you, Anne Marie. On behalf of the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, I'm pleased to welcome all of you today to this symposium about Sir William Osler. Sir William Osler is perhaps the most famous graduate of our faculty, and he certainly has had a profound impact and influence on the practice and teaching of medicine and on generations of physicians, both at McGill, but really around the world. But as Osler himself noted, none of us is flawless, and that applies to him as well. While systemic racism and structural barriers to advancement are not new, a series of horrific events over the past year have brought renewed attention and focus on the need to work to dismantle systemic racism and those barriers. And one result of that reflection has been a series of academic discussions like the one today, where we will ponder the question of how we can reconcile our historical luminaries and today's values. And contributing to bring these questions to the fore, especially in academia, is crucial. It is only in doing so that can we as a society learn from and evolve from them. Before I thank the panel, I want to thank the Medical Student Society, which really triggered this by passing a resolution questioning our ongoing veneration of Sir William Osler and asking the question whether Osler merited this attention, and also whether others merit attention and have been passed over. And this stimulated us to push for this for today's event. And I'm thrilled that we have such an esteemed panel from around the globe who are able to take their time to present on this important topic. I want to thank each of them for taking the time out of their busy schedule to contribute what I hope will be an intellectually stimulating and productive discussion. I would also like to thank Professor Suzanne Morton for moderating today's event. As well, I want to thank Anne Marie and her team from the Social Studies of Medicine, people in my office, the communications office, especially Jason Clement, the Osler Library, and the students who represent the McGill Osler Society, who have all worked to put the event together. And with that, I wish you all a great symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Eidelman. Before we begin our presentations, I'd like to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. First, a reminder that we ask you to please keep your cameras and microphones muted throughout the event, unless you are one of our panelists or moderator, of course. We have allotted ample time for the discussion period. If you have questions or comments at any point that you would like the panel to address, please submit them via the chat function, either to myself or to Jason Clement. Our panelists have each pre-recorded and submitted their presentations ahead of time. And in a moment, we will begin playing them in the following order. Professor Jenna Healy from Queen's University, Dr. Samir Shaheen Hussain from McGill University, Dr. Nadeem Tudayan from the University of Queensland, Osler librarian Mary Haig-Ural from McGill, of course, Dr. Andre Lametti from McGill, and Professor Christophe Gradman from the University of Oslo. But once the videos are done, Professor Suzanne Morton from the Department of History and Classical Studies here at McGill will serve as our moderator. Professor Morton is a social historian with a focus on post-Confederation Canada and author of 2 special book projects for McGill's bicentennial, Black McGill and Indigenous McGill. Stu, please start us off with the first video.
As a historian of medicine, I've long been familiar with Osler's legacy. But it was only a few years ago that I began my own research on Osler, and in particular, one event in his career, the creation and circulation of professional notes among the Indian tribes about Great Slave Lake, Northwest Territories, a hoax essay that purports to describe the sexual and obstetric practices of Indigenous peoples living in Canada's Northwest. Written in 1882, when Osler was 33 years old, it stands out from Osler's many other medical writings by virtue of being entirely fictional. Now preserved in the Osler Library, Osler's fantastical description of, quote, life among the natives reads like a catalog of racist tropes about Indigenous peoples, including descriptions of genital mutilation, placenta eating, and other, quote, vile customs. The first time I read this essay, I admit that I was slightly flabbergasted. To a modern reader, professional notes is decidedly unfunny and, in my own view, incredibly offensive. I had associated Osler with his famous textbook, his studies in pathology, and of course his role as the founder of the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. But Osler's decision to write a fictional treatise about the sexual and reproductive practice of Indigenous peoples raised a host of questions about the manuscript's provenance and its intended audience, some of which I will attempt to answer for you here today. This is an image of the original manuscript as it is preserved in the Osler Library. You might note that the essay is not in fact attributed to Osler, but to a man named Egerton Y. Davis, which was William Osler's alter ego, a pseudonym he used throughout his life to administer hoaxes unbefitting a man of his position. Indeed, Osler had a well-known penchant for practical jokes, many of which touched on gynecological or obstetrical subject matter, which provided Osler with medical cover to make crude jokes about sex or the female body. We can also see that across the original manuscript, Osler scribbled the words, "joke on Molson," which provides us with a hint as to the intended victim of this prank. The Molson in question was one William Alexander Molson, a member of the prominent banking and brewing family who, like Osler at the time, was a practicing physician in Montreal. Now, this is Osler at the time, around the time that professional notes would have been written in October 1881, and there's no surviving photograph of William Molson, but this is a building that many of you might recognize from Montreal. It stands across from the McGill campus today, and this was actually Molson's house that he built a little bit later in 1906. In 1879, Molson was appointed the co-editor of the Canada Medical and Surgical Journal. When Molson's co-editor went out of town, Osler decided to write and submit professional notes to the journal as a prank, which worked a bit better than perhaps Osler had intended it to. Instead of being scandalized by its contents, Molson failed to detect any parody and approved the essay for publication. According to Osler, he visited the journal's offices to find the essay being typeset and then prevented its publication. And yet, Osler was so proud of this prank that he preserved the manuscript, keeping it with him across 4 cities, 3 countries, and 2 continents so that it could be saved after his death. Now, Molson was a repeat target for Osler's pranks, and the evidence suggests that there was, at the very least, a rivalry between the 2 men, with some glimmers of genuine animosity. Not only did Molson have access to his family's large fortune, a situation that stood in contrast to Osler's own financial struggles at this moment in time, but in 1879, Molson married Esther Essie Shepherd, who is pictured here on the left, and here he is pictured with Shepherd and Essie on the right, and she was the object of Osler's affections. It seems likely then that Osler's grudge against Molson grew out of a romantic disappointment. And so on the most superficial level, we can understand professional notes as Osler's attempt to embarrass a professional and romantic rival, and this is where most of the historical analysis of this document stops. But this does nothing to explain why the joke took this particular form, or how Osler was able to write an anthropological parody so convincing it was accepted for publication. To understand this, we need to go back to the colonial context in which Osler grew up and the ways in which Osler himself was engaged with contemporary discourses of scientific racism. Osler was born in Bondhead, a village in Upper Canada, in 1849, where his father, an Anglican minister, had been dispatched as part of the colonial civilizing mission. While he primarily ministered to local Irish farmers, we do know that the parish was frequented by local Ojibwe peoples. According to Osler family lore, one Ojibwe parishioner once mistook an infant Osler for, quote, a papoose, and that is the word that is used in the journals, stoking fear amongst the family that, quote, someday they might run away with him. So this is a story that Osler grew up hearing about himself. In 1857, the Oslers relocated to the larger community of Dundas in order to secure better educational opportunities for the children. In that same year, the government of the province of Canada passed the Gradual Civilization Act, the first in a series of paternalistic legislative efforts to strip Indigenous peoples of their rights to land and sovereignty. A few years later, a 13-year-old Osler rallied his friends in Dundas to create a volunteer brigade of the Confederate Army, siding, as many British North Americans did, with the cause of the South in the American Civil War. Given the colonial context in which Osler was raised, it is perhaps not surprising that he would have internalized the attitudes of the ruling class in matters pertaining to race. It was around the same time that Osler began to express a keen interest in natural history, which in the mid-19th century overlapped significantly with the nascent discipline of anthropology. Reminiscing about his days as a young student, Osler fondly recalled evenings spent reading the works of, quote, the great masters, including Samuel George Morton's Crania Americana, widely considered to be a foundational text of scientific racism, as well as the writings of Louis Agassiz. Both men were proponents of polygenism, the idea that human races arose from individual acts of creation and thus were akin to separate species, which was commonly deployed by defenders of both slavery and colonial expansion as a scientific justification for white supremacy. And Osler's actually reflecting on this at the end of his life about how meaningful some of these texts were to him. A few years later, Osler studied under famous physician Rudolf Virchow in Berlin, who was known to be an amateur anthropologist as well as an avid collector of skulls. And here we can see Virchow depicted with his vast collection of human remains. When Osler returned to Europe in 1884, he brought Virchow, who was a much admired mentor, quote, 4 choice skulls of North American Indians, which he claimed to have been obtained in British Columbia. Such a gift reveals that Osler was not only familiar with the practice of craniometry, but that he was an active participant in the trade of illicitly obtained Indigenous remains. Just last month, the Toronto Star published their investigative report into the fate of these stolen Indigenous skulls. As it turns out, at least 2 of the skulls did not originate in British Columbia at all, but were dug up near Caledonia on the banks of the Grand River. Efforts are now underway for the remains to be reclaimed and returned for proper burial. Only a few years after this incident, Osler himself promised to donate his brain for scientific study after his own death, in hopes that it might offer insight into the biological origins of genius, and therefore the superiority of the British race. So we know that by the time he became a practicing physician and professor, Osler was familiar with the major works of scientific racism, as well as the 19th century practice of subdividing humanity into a hierarchy based on race. Then, sometime in late 1870, Osler came across the work of this man, George Julius Engelmann, who was an obstetrician from St. Louis, who had embarked on an anthropological study of the obstetrical customs among, quote, primitive peoples. Engelmann argued that in order to discover the, quote, most natural position for childbirth, one had to study the, quote, women of the savage races whose movements were still governed by instinct. Engelmann's work was heavily illustrated with woodcuts depicting naked Indigenous women laboring in outdoor settings, a stark contrast to similar images of white women who were always clothed and depicted indoors. There is no doubt that in writing professional notes, Osler was directly inspired by Engelmann's work. Much of the imagery Osler deploys is almost identical to those images found in Engelmann. Some scholars have suggested that, by writing professional notes, Osler's intention was to satirize or potentially critique the racist views of his peers. But I can find no evidence in either his intellectual or personal writings to support such a claim. And indeed, there's far more evidence to suggest that Osler chose Engelmann's work as his inspiration because writing about indigenous bodies gave him license to be as crude and outrageous as possible. Professional Notes shows us that not only was Osler uncritical of the work of his peers, but he actually delighted in denigrating the humanity of indigenous peoples upon whose land he resided. In closing, I'd like to offer a few thoughts of what I think we should take away from this short history of professional notes. One takeaway might be that Osler was a man of his time, and that he held views common among elite men of his upbringing and status. This is certainly true, with the caveat that given Osler's powerful position and his prodigious pen, he did more than just hold these views, he disseminated and promoted them. Much of my own research on professional notes, which I won't have time to explore further today, focuses on the little-known afterlife of Osler's manuscript. The first Osler librarian, W.W. Francis, was very fond of professional notes, and he secretly circulated it among Oslerian circles in the 1930s and 1940s. Medical students in England, Canada, and the United States would stage public readings of the manuscript, events that sent a less than subtle message about who belonged in elite medical spaces and who did not. This is why I bristle at the ways in which Osler's humor is often held up as an example of his superior character. Indeed, one article recently published in the Canadian Family Physician in 2015 encourages young Canadian physicians to emulate Osler and follow his lighthearted example, even though so much of his own humor was far from harmless or lighthearted. In writing this history, I'm not attempting to deny Osler's contributions to modern medical education, but his accomplishments do not justify his sanctification. In my opinion, any discussion of his legacy needs to include a frank acknowledgement of his racist views. We also need to take seriously how his racism may have been transmitted to his many trainees, as well as to the generations of physicians who have since been inspired by his life and work. Osler's views on race may have been mainstream in his own historical moment, but that does not mean that they were not actively harmful. And given Osler's outsized influence on many generations of physicians, these harms have been reproduced and amplified in the decades following his death. We now have a responsibility to redress these harms, and I'm hopeful that our conversation today will be a good start to reassessing how we might discuss Osler's legacy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samir Shaheen Hussain. I'm a pediatric emergency physician and assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine at McGill University. I want to thank the Department of Social Studies of Medicine, as well as Dean David Eidelman for the invitation today. Before beginning, I just want to make a quick disclosure statement. I have no conflicts of interest, in fact, to declare, except, of course, that a lot of what I'll be speaking about comes from my book. But all of my author's royalties will be directed to pre-designated organizations in support of Indigenous children, youth, and their communities. So I'm not getting any financial remuneration from the book. And these are the groups that those royalties are going to. So I've reflected a lot on what I should focus on for this presentation. My initial plan was to lay out a case to show why William Osler should not be celebrated as he is. I would do this by enumerating the various elements that Osler's own historians and biographers have already written about, although they've often done so from a perspective that either minimizes or justifies his sexism and racism. However, it then dawned on me that Osler's staunchest defenders are going to continue to try to recast his words and actions in a positive light, no matter how much proof there is to the contrary. And when they can't do this, they will levy the charge of presentism, suggesting that he was simply a man of his time. As such, I decided to take a slightly different approach in preparing for this presentation when my partner reminded me of a famous passage credited to the late author Toni Morrison about how racism works. It's important to know, she said, therefore, to know who the real enemy is and to know the function, the very serious function of racism, which is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Someone says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. Indeed, there will always be one more thing. For example, instead of taking tangible action like McGill University did by finally dropping the Redmond name for its men's varsity team, sports teams recently, or drawing on work done by educational and medical institutions in the United States to withdraw the names of previously highly regarded men like Abraham Flexner, Woodrow Wilson, and James Watson because of their racism, we have been invited to this symposium to move the conversation forward with respect to how we reconcile the major historical accomplishments of luminaries like Sir William Osler and others. But some contradictions can't be reconciled. Even the framing of this very symposium, how might we assess historical figures such as Sir William Osler given today's societal values, is misleading. This is not a question of today's societal values. In fact, basic understandings of fairness and decency echo throughout human societies across time and space. I have to admit that having these protracted, and in the case of Osler, long-standing discussions to decide whether it's justified to celebrate someone who espoused views that harm people seems like a total distraction and a waste of everyone's time, quite frankly, especially when the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at McGill University has more important things to do given its commitment to work to end health injustices stemming from anti-Black and anti-Indigenous systemic racism following the brutal deaths of George Floyd and Joyce Echaquan. At the end of the day, I have very little interest in discussing the merits of a man who died over a century ago when people are forced to live in situations and conditions today that are simply intolerable. I'm much more interested in figuring out how to work together to build a future where justice, dignity, and genuinely caring about people's well-being are core values. This being said, I do want to return to the point of presentism, which refers to an inappropriate and anachronistic judgment of historical figures like Osler based on present-day morals and values. This argument is frequently levied to thwart discussions, notably when the goal is to bring down statues that honor individuals whose very careers and reputations were based on very dishonorable acts. Essentially, Osler's admirers argue that he was simply a man of his age. But as I've written, even if we accept the premise of presentism, all of this depends on the vantage point we choose to take. Who determines which morals and values are circumscribed to a given period of history? Were colonizers and slave owners in North America simply men of their age? If that's the case, what about those, including the colonized and enslaved, who fought to end their oppression? Were they not also people of their age? Asking these questions reveals how those who wield power shape the present and recast the narratives of the past. As Chris Chapman and A.J. Withers highlight in their book, A Violent History of Benevolence, suggesting that influential and powerful figures of the past were simply individuals of their age or a product of their time is a way of framing historical racism that can minimize agency and the real complexity and diversity that already exists in any society, as well as different degrees of willingness to participate in various kinds of violence. The reality, of course, is that the presentism argument is simply false, including in the case of Osler, because he had contemporaries who had proved that his racist views were not immutable. Professor Jenna Healy just explained that Osler relied heavily on George Julius Engelmann's horrific pseudo-anthropological studies of supposedly primitive peoples when Osler wrote professional notes. However, at around exactly the same time that Osler penned professional notes, there was a man in search of adventure and prestige who spent over a year living with Inuit on Baffin Island after completing his doctoral studies in physics at some of the most highly regarded universities in Germany. Franz Boas, a man born into an urban, educated bourgeois Jewish family, would go on to play a role in reshaping the entire field of anthropology. Similar to Osler, he held preconceived notions of primitives that were prevalent at the time among the bourgeoisie and ruling class in North America and Europe. However, unlike Osler, he underwent a significant philosophical and spiritual transformation while living with and learning from Inuit, a transformation that allowed him to transcend his privileged circumstances through a process perhaps best described by the German concept of Herzensbildung, the training of one's heart to see the humanity of another. In a correspondence at the time, he wrote, "I often ask myself what advantage our good society possesses over that of the savages, and the more I see of their customs, I find that we have no right to look down upon them contemptuously. We should not censor them for their convictions, conventions, and superstitions, since we highly educated people are relatively much worse." In Gods of the Upper Air, award-winning author Charles King explains how Boas and others he later went on to work with at Columbia University in New York City, including true visionaries like Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, Zora Neale Hurston, and Ella Deloria, challenged the regressive classifications of human beings in contemporary Western societies. Their revolutionary ideas, which exposed the folly of hierarchy classifying individuals in society according to race and gender, came from genuinely implementing the scientific mindset, collecting data, questioning one's own theories, being self-critical, and practicing humility. They came to a basic conclusion that we often take for granted today: the essential connectedness of human beings. As King writes in his conclusion, the most enduring prejudices are the comfortable ones, those hidden up close. Seeing the world as it is requires some distance, a view from the upper air. Realizing the limitations of your own culture, even if it claims to be cultureless and global. Feeling the power of prayer if you reject someone else's God. Understanding the inner logic of bewildering political preferences. Sensing the worry and depression, the disquiet and rage caused in other people by the very outlooks on reality that seem wholly natural to you. These are skills built up over a lifetime. These are skills Osler didn't seem to have built up when it mattered most. In their Cmaj article, Nav Prasad, Heather Butts, and Philip Berger write about two Indigenous physicians, Dr. Edmund Jones and Oranyatika, both of them trained in Toronto around the same time as Osler. We also learn about Alexander Thomas Augusta, who was born in Virginia but did part of his medical training in Toronto before returning to the US to fight with the Union Army and then going on to teach anatomy at Howard University after the Civil War. Augusta was by definition also a man of his time, but he didn't share Osler's worldview in which white men dominated the social, political, and economic landscape. Augusta prominently fought racism in both Canada and the United States. The same can't be said of Osler. In Mary Equi, Radical Politics and Outlaw Passions, public historian Michael Helquist has written about how Dr. Equi had a reputation as an excellent diagnostician who embodied a holistic and radical approach to healthcare that sought to address root causes of illness. She was recognized for her medical relief efforts following the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco by President Theodore Roosevelt, and was the first woman to be honored with the rank of doctor in the US Army. She generated significant media coverage locally, regionally, and nationally during her life, with over 300 articles over 40 years since her arrival in Oregon in 1892. As a physician, she was at ease with working class patients and among laborers who worked the farms, forests, and factories. She helped women get access to birth control and abortion when both were illegal. The same can't be said of Osler. Today, barely anyone knows Equi's name, but Osler's name is not only associated with physical exam findings and medical conditions, but also adorns libraries, amphitheaters, hospitals, and streets. His legacy is so strong as to warrant a symposium like this one, with speakers and participants from across the globe. Some may argue Osler wasn't racist by citing cherry-picked examples of how he liked people from different cultures and pointing out that he may even have had a few friends who weren't white. That doesn't make him an anti-racist. An anti-racist would mean that instead of writing professional notes, Osler would have led efforts to put an end to the Indian Act that legislated a form of apartheid in Canada with far-reaching impacts on Indigenous health. Or at the very least, he would have lobbied to rescind the enfranchisement provisions contained in some of the earliest Indian Acts, which resulted in an individual's removal from their banned list if they joined the medical profession. Instead of accepting segregated wards at the Johns Hopkins Hospital and being an active member of the American Medical Association when it rejected membership applications from qualified racialized physicians, as argued by Prasad, Butts, and Berger, he would have fought against Jim Crow laws in the United States. And when he was in the United Kingdom, instead of being one of the vice presidents of the first International Eugenics Conference, and a couple of years later making headlines by expressing his white nationalist fervor, stating that we are bound to make our country a white man's country in response to the infamous Komagata-Maru incident on the shores of British Columbia, he would have done his part to counter the racial scapegoating of immigrants that was occurring in the Western world. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery and became a prominent abolitionist, famously stated, "The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one or may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Douglas is said to have made this speech in 1857, when Osler would have been around 8 years old. I guess Douglas didn't get the memo about presentism. But the question I'd like to earnestly ask, people to earnestly ask themselves upon reflecting on Douglas's statement is, whose side was Osler on? Was he on the side of those struggling, making progress, demanding freedom, or was he on the side of power that concedes nothing? I don't deny Osler's contributions to medicine, nor am I proposing that those be ignored or erased, but there is no reason for Osler to ever have been put on a pedestal as a patron saint of medicine or of humanistic physicians, as some have. While some attending the symposium may disagree with me, I suspect that there are many who would agree. It's just a question of who is asked to weigh in on this discussion. Rick Hill from the Beaver Clan of the Tuscarora Nation has spent a large chunk of his life reclaiming and repatriating Indigenous peoples' desecrated remains that were looted by colonizers and settlers. Why don't we ask what he thinks of Osler and the 4 choice skulls of North American Indians he brought to Rudolf Virchow in Germany? Closer to home, why don't we ask folks from Kahnawake what they think about Osler, given that his alter ego, Egerton Y. Davis, was a US surgeon who was fictitiously based there? In professional notes, Osler used words like disgusting and vile animal habit to describe practice that he ascribed to Indigenous peoples. Did we not hear such sentiments echoed by healthcare providers spewing racist and sexist hatred against Joyce Echaquan moments before her brutal death in a Joliet hospital this past September? There is no one individual who is responsible for all of this, but there is a hostile medical culture that still allows such enraging acts of medical violence to exist even today. As such, it is important to recognize that influential individuals played a role in creating this culture back then and that others continue to maintain it today. Osler can't be faulted for the fact that people have elevated him to the rank of a deity, and that there is now a cult-like religious following that continues to honor his legacy. However, as Irene Moore Davis, president of the Essex County Historical Research Society, has said, what we accept, what we honor, who we choose to honor, says a lot about what we value as a society. As I've written, there are many drawbacks to creating mythologies around individuals. Monuments cast shadows. Perhaps the most damaging consequences of erecting monuments for individuals, including for men like Osler, is that they invisibilize the work of others who, as part of larger collectives and movements, could serve as inspiring examples for future generations of healthcare providers committed to social justice. This symposium about is about William Osler, but the undercurrents go way deeper than that, because this discussion is also about which historical figures we choose to commemorate. Celebrating men like Osler harks back to an era that was foundational to the hierarchy, authoritarianism, elitism, and oppressive tendencies that the medical establishment has come to represent for many people and entire communities. However, time's up. Instead, it's time we seriously begin to question why we are so obsessed with elevating powerful white men in the first place. It's time we stopped erecting and spotlighting these monuments. It's time we started meaningfully listening to the voices, ideas, and aspirations of those who have been relegated to the shadows for too long. One of those voices is that of Terry Suntjens, who is from Saddle Lake Cree Nation. Suntjens was a co-chair of the Indigenous Naming Committee for the City of Edmonton's initiative to rename its wards. But instead of focusing on individuals, her committee decided early on to honor the land. She said, "We do not think of people as above us or below us. We don't put people up on pedestals. That is not our way." It's time for us to learn from the examples set by others. After all, if, as some have claimed, Osler decried divisiveness in all its forms, encouraged social harmony, and if his most attractive quality was truly his unconditional love for others, then I ask you, wouldn't he do the same? Thank you very much.
To the earnest student of medicine, the school that graduated Osler must forever seem to be on holy ground. Dr. Norman Gwen's reverential 1920 remark concerning his famous physician uncle reflects the immense esteem with which William Osler has been held by several generations of physicians all over the world. It is a sentiment that has recently come under attack, after a series of increasingly hostile criticisms of Osler made by individuals from the very same school that famously graduated him. This symposium seeks to discuss how might we assess historical figures such as Sir William Osler given today's societal values. It might be more instructive, however, to inquire, how might we regard today's societal values, given how universally loved historical figures like William Osler are coming to be irreverently discredited and dishonored? Tread softly and circumspectly in this funambulatory track and narrow path of goodness. Pursue virtue virtuously. Leaven not good actions, nor render virtues disputable. Stain not fair acts with foul intentions. Maim not uprightness by halting concomitances, nor circumstantially deprave substantial goodness. These are the words of William Osler's virtual mentor and spiritual sage, Sir Thomas Browne. May they provide ample guidance to those of us engaged in combating systemic inequalities in healthcare. William Osler exerted a profoundly uniting influence over the medical profession both during his lifetime and for many decades after his death. His continuing capacity to bring medical professionals together through high-minded precept and humanism was well demonstrated throughout the centenary year of his death in 2020, when several commemorative events and whole journals were dedicated to his memory. Professor Charles Bryan, the world's leading authority on William Osler, even brought out an Osler encyclopedia. Osler is presented in the encyclopedia as the most famous and best-loved physician in the English-speaking world during the early 20th century, his vitality, kindness, and love of fellow humans being regarded as his top character strengths. But the Osler centenary year has also been a time of hitherto unrivaled criticisms of William Osler. Notwithstanding extensive and diversified support for Osler's professional leadership all throughout the past century, a small but determined minority of critics have recently urged us to openly renounce William Osler, to bar his name from public consumption, and to reevaluate his place in the medical curriculum. These critics have centered their reappraisal around the really very remarkable claim that William Osler personally held racist and white supremacist views, thereby contributing to the normalization of racial inequalities in medicine. These highly divisive criticisms of Osler were published by the Canadian Medical Association Journal and other prominent Canadian news outlets late last year. Osler's critics have been quick to capitalize on his reported 28 May 1914 remarks regarding Canadian immigration policy, when he reportedly stated that our fellow Indian citizens cannot come in on equal terms with Europeans. We are bound to make our country a white man's country. Little note is made of the actual context of these remarks by Osler's critics, nor has anybody noted Osler's follow-up comments to his friend Thomas Brassey on the very next day. I shall be glad to be at the meeting, Osler wrote. I'm not quite sure that any words of mine should be of value, so that I would rather not speak. We colonials occupy rather an anomalous position here in the political world. It is possible that Osler regretted his earlier remarks or otherwise decided not to further comment on such matters. Whatever the case may be, Osler would later candidly admit to his own propensity for making orated errors, personally describing himself on the eve of his 70th birthday as the possessor of a wild and wagging tongue that has often got me into trouble. William Osler was one of the profession's great peacemakers and persistently advanced an all-embracing vision for the future of scientific medicine. His own professional outlook was distinctly cosmopolitan. Free cosmopolitan, no longer hampered by the dogmas of schools, Osler meditated in a September 1897 speech in Montreal. We may feel a just pride in a profession almost totally emancipated from the bondage of error and prejudice. Distinctions of race, nationality, color, and creed are unknown within the portals of the temple of Asclepius. Dare we dream, Osler continues, that this harmony and cohesion so rapidly developing in medicine, obliterating the strongest lines of division, knowing no tie of loyalty but loyalty to truth. Dare we hope, I say, that in the wider range of human affairs a similar solidarity may ultimately be reached. Osler not only encouraged but modeled this ideal before his students, advising them to get denationalized early, for the true student is a citizen of the world, the allegiance of whose soul at any rate is too precious to be restricted to a single country. The great minds, the great works transcend all limitations of time, of language, and of race. Osler's essays consistently present a worldview that is completely incompatible with the divisive philosophies attributed to him by present-day critics. Persaud and others have further pursued Osler for donating 4 choice examples of skulls of British Columbian Indians to his German mentor Rudolf Virchow's anthropological collection. Riding on a contemporary wave of indigenous repatriation rights, Osler's critics used this finding to portray both Osler and Virchow in a decidedly negative light. But they could not possibly have chosen poorer targets in their campaign for social justice. Rudolf Virchow has been called the Pope of Medicine for his social activism and advancement of public health measures in Germany. As a democratic member of the Reichstag, he demanded full and unlimited democracy, education, freedom, and prosperity for all, famously remarking that the physicians are the natural attorneys of the poor, and social problems should largely be solved by them. Virchow's message inspired Osler's own 70th birthday tribute to him, which commenced with a characteristically compelling call for professional unity. By his commission, the physician is sent to the sick, and knowing in his calling neither Jew nor Gentile, bond or free, perhaps he alone rises superior to those differences which separate and make us dwell apart, too often oblivious to the common hopes and common frailties which should bind us together as a race. There is left with us a strong feeling of brotherhood, a sense of unity which the limitations of language, race, and country have not been able to efface. Osler has been criticized on behalf of historically racialized physicians who were marginalized in their time, but what did historical racialized physicians themselves have to say of Osler? For a great man, he was modesty itself, and whenever he asked questions about my country or my work, it was with true humility. Add to this his unfailing geniality and bonhomie, which won him the affection of both graduates and undergraduates from all lands, including the Orient, and one can picture the beneficial influence exercised by him during the 15 years of his stay at Oxford University. These are the words of the distinguished Malayan-born Chinese physician Dr. Wu Lin-te, who is otherwise known for popularizing anti-epidemic face masks during the 1911 Manchurian plague. Lin-te reflected on personally meeting Sir William Osler in 1912 and 1913, concluding that he was a great man, a unique teacher, a complete physician, a fine judge, a lovable friend, an accurate historian, and an unrivaled conversationalist. The remarks of John Andrew Kenny Sr., a prominent African-American surgeon and foundation member of the National Medical Association, are even more compelling. In a March 1946 address to the Cook County Physicians Association, Kenny stated, "I question seriously whether there is any physician whose imprint is more indelibly inculcated on the medicine of his day than that of Sir William Osler. Osler rightfully takes place as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, and certainly the leading light of his age. And yet, in spite of his greatness," Kenny continues, "he was modest and humane, easily approached, and his popularity was universal. I believe it safe to say that no medical man of his generation, nor of any before, has so completely captivated both lay and professional adoration as did Sir William Osler." Osler's critics request that the accomplishments of racialized physicians be more widely recognized at the expense of further propagating Osler's legacy. And yet Osler was himself widely admired for celebrating the medical contributions of others. He was particularly indiscriminate in praising good medical work, and included references to contributions from diverse backgrounds in his April 1913 Yale lectures on the evolution of modern medicine. In July of 1913, he specifically sought out the Kurdish physician Dr. Said Khan, with views to personally restoring the Hamadan tomb of the 11th century Persian polymath Avicenna, one of the greatest names in the history of medicine, who, according to Osler, authored the most famous medical textbook ever written. Osler's appreciation for others' works was unaffected by racial considerations. In early 1911, William Osler spent 6 weeks abroad in Egypt with his older brother Edmund Boyd, taking in the historical sights and natural scenery along the Nile Valley. Preserved letters from this trip written to his wife Grace indicate Osler's uncommon openness towards foreign cultures and customs. Osler showed considerable interest in visiting the 1,000-year-old Al-Azhar Islamic University in Cairo, and further fraternized with his tour guide Ahmed Barodi, pictured here, a big burly fellow who has been to Mecca and is no end of a swell. Osler carried and read his own English translation of the Quran, probably to better relate to the locals. Special note must be made here of William Osler's remarkably liberal attitudes towards Muslims, aspects of which are clearly demonstrated in this handwritten letter by Osler dated February 18, 1911. The Musulman at prayer is the most impressive thing I have yet seen. 'Tis the secret of the most successful religion if one judges by numbers. To see a great stalwart fellow stop his work at the call from some distant mosque and go through the impressive ritual of his prayers, and when we read in lane the beautiful words of that prayer, the feeling comes of the intense realism of their faith and its magnificent tribute to the majesty and eminence of the one God. At noon today, through the glasses, I watched a man, the only living thing in sight, at the edge of the desert. It seemed the very apotheosis of worship, so simple, so fitting in its attitude, and with words so appropriate to human feelings. This photo of just such a man was taken by William Osler himself around the same time the quoted letter was written. Even by modern standards, Osler was incredibly tolerant towards Egypt's Muslim population. "Write me as one who loves his fellow men" was a favorite quotation of Osler's. Osler's critics ask why he was not more vocal in his condemnation of racism and the slave trade, implying that Osler therefore supported these practices. Let us contrast Osler's apolitical attitudes then with the views of his much-loved colleague Sir Victor Horsley, an impassioned socio-political reformer who advocated for women's suffrage, national temperance, and the appointment of the first ever coloured consultant neurologist James Riseen Russell at the National Hospital in Queen Square, London. Notwithstanding his international reputation as a pioneering neurosurgeon, Horsley's radical views alienated him from his colleagues towards the end of his career, most notably during a 1911 debate concerning the National Insurance Bill. Osler, on the other hand, was never a strong protagonist. As Harvey Cushing explains, his sense of fair play, his charity for the other fellow's foibles and failings, and his sense of humor would have made him unsuccessful as the great leader of a cause. Looking always for the best in others, Osler echoed the feelings of Horsley's students on his own deathbed, movingly describing Horsley in his final ever publication as a pathfinder who unraveled difficulties in most various branches, the most generous collaborator and friend to all young scientific workers, most unselfish, animated by none but the noblest feelings, a protagonist of all oppressed, chaperoning their causes without the least regard to his own career. Such was Victor Horsley as many of us knew him, and as we love to think of him. I have no doubt that so long as the pursuit of truth is faithfully preserved, William Osler would have similarly supported present-day efforts to rid the medical profession of racism. I hope I have convinced at least some of you that William Osler's life and teachings are worthy of our ongoing respect and attention. Owing to what has been conserved of Osler's legacy over the past 100 years, I have been able to draw on various resources to show that he was indeed a great and a good man. Let us preserve this remarkable record, and rejoice in the sentiment well expressed by Norman Gwen at the outset of my presentation, so that perhaps in the many years ahead, others too may delight to recall the great physician, the clear-voiced apostle of the medicine of today, the beloved son of old McGill.
Thank you to McGill's Department of Social Studies of Medicine for inviting me to present at this symposium. First, I'd like to acknowledge this presentation was recorded on the traditional territory of the Ganyengaga Nation. My name is Andre Lametti, and I'm a recent graduate of McGill University's medical school. I am currently undergoing postgraduate training in anatomical pathology, also at McGill. I was invited to offer a learner's perspective on William Osler, but of course, I do not speak on behalf of all trainees. As is custom, I'd like to begin with relevant disclosures. While this may seem a bit strange, as the big Osler lobby isn't known to be a force in humanities research, I would like to make a point about how enormously Osler's name has been present in my academic life. All this is not by virtue of a specific interest or involvement with Osler himself, but rather simply because I happened to train at McGill. This commemorative plaque is located immediately to the west of the main entrance to the faculty's McIntyre Medical Sciences building. In 1999, the upper portion of Drummond Street, on which the McIntyre building is located, was renamed Promenade Sir William Osler, in a ceremony presided over by then-incoming University Chancellor Dick Pound. There is also a plaque dedicated to Osler at the entrance of the auditorium bearing his name at the Montreal General Hospital. The library housed within the faculty is named after him. The physician mentors officially sanctioned by the faculty are called Osler Fellows. A well-publicized yearly essay contest for medical students is also partly named after him. It is obvious to any medical student at McGill with a pulse that William Osler is the preeminent figure of the faculty, without having to know anything about him whatsoever. And in fact, most do not. I would consider it a success for one of my colleagues to be able to mumble a few words about bedside teaching. Despite my best efforts, Osler remains the most represented topic in my own limited library. Most of these books were given to me by lecturers and by faculty leadership. Although I have classified these books with other works about history, Osler lives very much in the present at McGill. Here is where my path diverges from the average medical student's knowledge of Osler. I was awarded this Medal of Osler for a rather dull and technical essay about medieval medicine, but I shared the award with my fellow student Claire Fogarty, who authored an essay on the medical inadmissibility of immigrants to Canada, which was published in the McGill Journal of Medicine last year. This essay did not mention Osler directly, but a discussion ensued among the Oslerians present where, among other topics, the issue of Osler's public comments during the Komagata Maru incident were brought up. This naturally piqued the interest of some of my colleagues, who were surprised to hear such things about McGill Medicine's most famous son. Some of them looked further into what they had heard about, and generated a very well-researched and balanced motion to reconsider the way in which Osler's name is used at McGill. Even though I did not contribute significant intellectual content to the motion, I agreed to sponsor it. At the time, I was an active and relatively well-known member of the student union. Unfortunately, this topic was correctly perceived to have the potential for controversy and retribution, because of Osler's important place in the collective imagination of the faculty. This risk was even greater if such criticism were to originate from more junior medical students, or from members of the student body who were women, indigenous, or part of a visible minority. Briefly, this motion recognized the importance of Osler's legacy and the appropriateness of certain of his eponyms, such as the Osler Library, which houses his significant collection. It also expressed the incompatibility between Osler's and McGill's values today, using as examples Osler's comments about the Komagata Maru incident, where he said that Canada should be a white man's country, as well as an incident where he was hostile to a woman entering Johns Hopkins medical school. In conclusion, the motion called upon McGill to stop using Osler's name uncritically, and to broaden its naming practices. Although there was some debate about this motion, it ultimately was adopted by a comfortable margin. It turns out that the intuitions of my colleagues were correct. In the latter half of last year, several articles were published in journals and the mainstream media concerning these well-documented but ignored aspects of Osler's life and works. Two articles in particular were instrumental in returning Osler to the public eye: Samir Shaheen Hussein's opinion column in the Montreal Gazette, as well as Nav Prasad's and collaborators' article in the Canadian Medical Association's journal. In addition to the Komagata Maru comments I alluded to earlier, these pieces also shed light on Osler's opinions and actions towards Black people, Indigenous people, and Latin Americans, all of which were softened by his biographers and tempered by many scholars of Osler ever since. The beatification of Osler is significant, these authors argue, because it contributes to erase the contributions of some of his contemporaries, and more importantly, because refusal to honestly recognize Osler's moral failings is intertwined with the ongoing challenges of racism and sexism within medicine and medical education. The Toronto Star also published an article about the Cmaj piece, as well as a two-part series about an international operation to secure the return of the skulls of 4 Indigenous people given by Osler to Rudolf Virchow. The responses to these publications were swift and entirely predictable. Nav Prasad's article in particular spawned an impressive amount of answers and letters to the editor. I believe this symposium was organized at least partly in this context. Among these responses, a few provided additional information and others were supportive of the authors. But for the most part, these responses tended to defend Osler based on his historical context, his writings, the need to balance his faults with his contributions, and cautions against engaging in presentism. Such responses are not new, and they are not unique to Osler either. Of course, all of this just leads to more questions. I will not delve into the details of the various statements and actions of Osler that have fed this controversy, because in general, the way they are criticized, defended, or explained remains the same. As an illustration, I have reproduced here the totality of the response to Nav Prasad's article by Brian Cornelson, a physician in Calgary. I think it is quite interesting, as it is a concise summary of many of the other responses that were published. It alludes to the issue of presentism, a cost-benefit analysis of Oslerian critique, and an argument regarding our own moral failings. Many of my lines of questioning directly address the central argument of this response. So, in the limited time I'd have, I'd like to draw your attention to a few questions that I find particularly relevant. First, whose time are we referring to when we say that Osler was a man of his time? Second, what is the significance of the medical community's reaction to criticism of Osler? And third, in which way is Osler's name and legacy actually used today? A great deal of responses to criticism of Osler has been centered around the issue of presentism. In the context of Osler, presentism is usually defined as an analytic error that consists in the inappropriate use of a present point of view to evaluate the past. As for most things, it is possible to find an Osler quote about it. In 1905, Osler was reported in the British Medical Journal to have made some observations at the unveiling of a statue of Thomas Brown, Osler's favorite author. I have reproduced a passage on this slide where Osler defends Brown for having been actively complicit in the practice of witch burning, arguing that most, but not all, physicians at the time were of the same stripe. Osler says, "A man must be judged by his day, by his generation, and by his contemporaries." The problem here is that deciding whose morals are the morals of the time in question is a perilous exercise. What would the witches being burned have thought about Thomas Brown's moral compass? What about the passengers of Kamagara Maru and Osler? What would the indigenous communities whose ancestors' skulls were taken as collector's items have to say? These questions seem to have been disregarded by many commentators who, like Osler, hail from the stratum of society that writes the history books. The corollary of this problem is that if we refuse to take a present viewpoint to pass moral judgment on historical figures, it makes even less sense to choose an arbitrary set of morals from the past to do the same. We cannot by the same historical token excuse Osler for his unpleasant sides, but also uphold him in the present as a role model for moral rectitude. Here is an example from more modern publications. A Cmaj article in 1997 praised Osler for, surprisingly, not being as putatively anti-Semitic as Thomas Brown. But an editorial in that same issue by Faith Wallace reminded the authors that to interpret Brown's writing as anti-Semitic was also to fall into the sin of presentism. We cannot have our cake and eat it too. It's also important to remember that presentism is not a broad-spectrum defense of Osler's character, as he also engaged in behavior such as body snatching and pressure tactics to secure unauthorized autopsies that were both illegal and immoral at the time. Context provides explanations, not justification. So, with this in mind, let's examine the reactions of our contemporaries to criticism of Osler. Of course, if we are to accept Osler's belief that a man must be judged by his own generation, he would presumably not be too troubled by criticism levied against him today. It is also dubious that demythologizing Osler's legacy would lead to a negation of the importance of his contributions to bedside teaching, clerkship, residency, university-affiliated teaching hospitals, and lifelong learning. So why then do calls for nuance elicit such a swift reaction? As stated in Cornelson's reply to Nav Prasad's article, the current dominant culture in medicine is perhaps not as far from the culture of Osler's milieu as we would like to think. While there is always a publicly stated commitment to equality, our behavior within the in-group can be quite reminiscent of Osler's pranks, pseudonyms, and private remarks. Interestingly, raising this point to those that engage in reprehensible behavior is immediately interpreted as an attack and viewed as hypocritical or holier than thou. In fact, this hidden curriculum of private discrimination is so strong and universal that even medical students who have just begun clerkship are immediately able to perceive it and define it. it is very difficult to accept this criticism of Osler without also questioning our own role and moral responsibility in systemic injustice that persists to this day in medicine. In a way, it hits close to home in an embarrassing way. In response to Cornelsen, I would argue that those who articulate these criticisms today do not do so from a position of moral superiority over the past. Rather, it stems from a recognition of ongoing collective moral turpitude. Perhaps we should be more worried about how the future will judge us. The last question I'd like to address is Osler's role and nature today as he is used, or appears to be used, by McGill University. Generations of physicians at McGill have been reminded year after year during their training about the faculty's most famous son. For example, it is almost certain that any presentation given at McGill to prospective medical residents will include a slide about McGill's rich history, of course, including a picture of Osler without much additional context. The mythical Osler passed down through the generations has become devoid of meaning, except as a currency for historical value that sets McGill and its ecosystem apart from everyone else. In other words, Osler has become a simulacrum. Questions and concerns from students who have discovered Osler's so-called dark side are often seen as uninformed or downright ignorant. But of course, these questions do not concern the real historical Osler. They concern the mythologized, almost godlike figure of Osler, whose name is inscribed repeatedly on the grounds of the faculty and within the curriculum itself. To respond to such criticism aimed at Saint Osler by alluding to Osler's historical context seems almost pedantic or to be missing the point. After all, it is not surprising to anyone that a flesh-and-bones upper-class Victorian physician would have had opinions that are incompatible with McGill's stated values in 2021. What is surprising is that these failings would be occulted by the unidimensional use of Osler promulgated today by our institutions. In support of this view is the perhaps ironic fact that essentially no one seems to have taken issue with McGill's continued reliance on Osler's legacy, despite a gradual move away from his views on teaching, for example via the widespread adoption of competency-based medical education. Again, this is because the modern, purely photographic Osler has become completely divorced from the real Osler. Although this concerns Osler's particular situation only peripherally, there has been a growing trend among medical institutions in Canada to accept donations in return for naming rights, mostly due to increasing financial pressures. In parallel, there has been greater recognition of the potential harms associated with naming university assets after individuals. McGill itself updated its policy on naming and renaming in late December 2019, in the very explicit context of university advancement. And of course, our own Faculty of Medicine, sensitive to the importance of names, recently rebranded itself as the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. Of course, this is all occurring in a wider societal context of questioning who is not, and who ought to be honored with eponyms, plaques, and statues. What then of Osler? Although the faculty at McGill is surprisingly not named after William Osler, I hope that I have more or less convincingly shown that his name is deeply intertwined with it. I believe it is not an option to leave the current situation unaddressed. For a substantive part of McGill's medical community, the continued use of this caricatured version of Osler will come to symbolize an inability to translate statements about equity and inclusion into actions. I am not suggesting that any trace of Osler should be purged from McGill, far from it. For that matter, neither does the general student body, judging from the General Assembly motion I alluded to earlier. But we can definitely do better. Based on this ongoing conversation, I have two hopes. First, I hope that we reflect on the importance of the choices we make about the way we construct our common narratives, and perhaps more importantly, on who is doing the construction, for whom, and who gets left out. These histories are foundational to any community, and have long-lasting and profound impact on the collective of caregivers and their patients. Second, I hope that we abandon the mythologized and superficial version of Osler that we have allowed to become dominant. The real Osler offers us a much more powerful and relevant tool to educate just physicians. I cannot think of a better example to teach that excellence alone cannot free us from our biases, and that to conform to our dominant culture of inequity is to be complicit in its perennity. Thank you all for your kind attention, and I look forward to our panel discussion on this important topic.
This afternoon, I have been tasked with addressing the legacy of Sir William Osler at McGill. What is that legacy, and how should we be framing it to reflect our sensibilities in the early 21st century? I have been asked to speak not as a scholar of Osler, I am not one, but because I am the librarian responsible for the Osler Library of the History of Medicine. The Osler Library is located on the traditional lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka, lands which have served as a meeting place for many First Nations. Given that it was during his time at McGill that Osler wrote his infamous unpublished article on Indigenous birthing practices, at once calling out those who would present such abominable ideas as academic fact, while perpetuating the same by turning them into a joke. Given that piece was produced by Osler when he was a youthful McGill professor, it is even more important to make this acknowledgement about the lands on which the library exists. The question of Osler's legacy and how we can and should discuss his contributions and his flaws is a complicated one. It is complicated because we seem to be at one of those points in time that remind us that one of the few certainties in history is that it will be rewritten. Historians have long known this, and so did Osler. But to start, I'll call on Lucien Febvre. In the introduction to The Problem of Unbelief in the 16th Century, Febvre alluded to the dangers of imposing modern perspectives upon people of the past. Every period mentally constructs its own image of the historical past. We seem today to have everything we need in order to know our contemporaries, and yet, a rascal, say some, a saint, say others, speaking of the same man. History is not easy. Legacy is not easy. As Osler librarian, I hold the keys to Osler's legacy, but I am not responsible for his reputation. I have an ethical obligation to make sure that I provide access that is open and equitable. I am responsible for safeguarding his library, his archive, so that anyone who wants to explore, to draw their own conclusions, may do so now and in the future. As an historian, I take a cautious approach to legacy, and not only because, to paraphrase Febvre, a person may seem good in one set of eyes, wretched in another. It is also because my natural inclination to resist the tendency for legacy to be good or bad. Humans are messy. Having been asked to consider Osler's legacy at McGill, I feel equipped only to relay what I see. That is, my observations upon how others interact with him, how he seems still to exist at McGill, and not only in the Osler room, where his ashes reside in the niche. Osler's legacy at McGill extends far beyond the time he lived in Montreal. But it was at McGill that Osler laid the foundations of the approaches for which he is known. When he arrived here in 1870 at the age of 21, he had already studied at the University of Toronto for 2 years. He transferred to the McGill medical faculty because of the opportunity it offered for clinical education. In North America at the time, one could graduate as a doctor without ever encountering a patient. The Montreal General Hospital had the distinction of being the only such institution in North America where students could enter without being accompanied by a faculty member. After graduating from McGill in 1872, Osler did what any ambitious, scientifically minded doctor did at that time. He went to Europe to gain an education in the medical sciences, histology, pathology, physiology, that were lacking in North America. His studies in London, Berlin, Vienna solidified the emphasis upon teaching with a microscope that he cultivated when he returned to McGill as a young professor in 1874. So committed was Osler to bringing the microscope to McGill that he took an additional job in the smallpox ward, subsequently catching the disease, and applied the $600 he earned towards the purchase of 15 Hartnett microscopes for his students. When he received an additional appointment as attending physician at the Montreal General Hospital in 1878, Osler commenced the bedside and amphitheater clinical teaching for which he is remembered. Osler's use of the microscope and bedside teaching both had a lasting impact on medical education at McGill. But he was not alone in reforming the curriculum and giving the medical sciences a starring role. He had good company in the new methods practiced and demonstrated by Francis Shepherd, Thomas Roddick, and George Ross. The activities Osler pursued are too numerous to list, but included the founding of the McGill Medical Society and co-founding of the McGill Graduate Society. He was actively involved in the development of the medical library and the medical museum. Suffice it to say, much of what we continue to see of Osler's name at McGill today began with Osler himself. The physician apprenticeship program, begun in 2005, invokes Osler's legacy deliberately. Mentors are called Osler Fellows, as a reflection of the humanism that Osler promoted in his writings and dealings with students. When Osler left McGill for the University of Pennsylvania in 1884, he had laid the foundations of his legacy. As he continued his work elsewhere, his corresponding rise in professional status served to solidify his reputation at McGill, especially since he kept in touch with and was generous to his alma mater. What I see from my work in Osler's library extends far beyond the nearly 8,000 volumes Osler bequeathed to McGill under the name Bibliotheca Osleriana, the Osler Library. I appreciate the directed inclusiveness of his project, explicitly inviting in students and the French, which was notable at the time not because of the language, but because of the virulent anti-Catholicism in British Protestant society. I witness Osler's legacy firsthand because I welcome Oslerians, many of whom are alumni, to the library. What Osler represents at McGill is a timeless humanism. His advice is realistic and grounded in a sense of reality about just how awful humans can be. But his words from his 1905 address, The Qualities Required of a Physician, also empower and provide hope that one can overcome life's burdens. It is sad to think that for some of you, there is in store disappointment, perhaps failure. You cannot hope to escape the cares and anxieties incident to professional life. Stand up bravely, even against the worst. Your very hopes may have passed on out of sight. You may be left to struggle in the night alone. Well for you if you wrestle on, for in persistency lies victory. And with the morning may come a wished-for blessing, but not always. There is a struggle with defeat, which some of you will have to bear. Remember, too, that sometimes from our desolation only does the better life begin. Even with disaster ahead and ruin imminent, it is better to face them with a smile and with head erect than to crouch at their approach. And if the fight is for principle and justice, even when failure seems certain, where many have failed before, cling to your ideal. It has been said that in patience ye shall win your souls. And what is this patience but an equanimity which enables you to arise superior to the trials of life? Osler's lasting impact, not only at McGill but around the world, has been to inspire and give hope to those who are committed to making things better, who are committed to remembering that every single patient is a human being, regardless of race, gender identity, age, religion. I don't always agree with Osler, and there were plenty of things he was wrong about, including his very dated vision of medieval medicine. I imagine some of his behavior as laddish and rather obnoxious, but those are all common aspects of his gender and place in society, that is, as a white settler male. His power of empathy, his ability to connect to other humans was extraordinary. His racism, his sexism were ordinary. It may also be worth reflecting on Osler's position in society. He was born a white son of the British Empire, which conferred a certain status, and arguably also conferred an unconscious sense of Anglo supremacy, a confidence that the English way was the right way. However, to the extent that he later became a member of the elite, he did so on his own merits. He was not born into wealth or power, and his standing as a missionary's son would have made him respectable. Money was a constant concern for Osler. Being a professor at McGill did not come with a living wage. His studies, his further education in Europe, his book buying were funded in large part by his brothers who had gone into the more lucrative fields of law and finance. That made Osler's position precarious. Moreover, the society he inhabited was deeply conservative. Nonetheless, he influenced change through teaching. Osler used his words well, but he was also clever about where he applied them. Those who work in public health know that a highly effective way to change behavior in society is to target students. Those who are still learning might be expected to change their ways, their attitudes. Osler knew this. He was a dedicated and personable teacher, and one whose message continues to offer people the mental tools they need, not only to improve as individuals, but also, as in the quote about equanimity, to get through hard times. His message is aspirational, but realistic. If we are struggling with Osler and his legacy at McGill today, it is because so much of his wisdom is timeless, but he was a man of his time. In the 21st century, it is important to talk about Osler's racism, but not for the reasons that have shaped recent discussions. The racism that Osler reflected is arguably more relevant now than it has been previously, because those who occupy positions of privilege and power are just beginning to grapple with the existence and impact of systemic racism and unconscious bias. And we still have a long way to go. Our provincial premier denies that systemic racism exists. Osler's letters, publications, lectures contain very few references to race. The few times his words were undeniably racist, They seem to be more a reflection of what was around him than a conscious core belief. But that does not mean we should dismiss or excuse his racist remarks. On the contrary, their presence, even in small number, offers a stark warning about the pervasiveness of prejudice that affects each and every one of us. It is worth weighing his racist words against his warnings about nationalism, coupled with strong expectations of the medical profession. Nationalism has been the greatest curse of humanity. What I inveigh against is a cursed spirit of intolerance that makes the mental attitude perennially antagonistic to everything foreign, that subordinates everywhere the race to the nation, forgetting the higher claims of human brotherhood. While medicine is everywhere tinctured with national characteristics, the wider aspects of the profession should always save us from the more vicious aspects of this sin, if it cannot prevent it altogether. Osler's concerns about nationalism and his feeling that medicine was a profession to heal not only bodies, but the ills of the world, reflect an optimism which gets back at the legacy of Osler as someone whose words offer hope that what is lacking can be installed or restored. Osler speaks to what his admirers want medicine to be. He speaks with legitimacy because he never pretends to be anything other than an imperfect being. To think further about how we can process the racism that Osler reflected, I turn to a piece that is key to our current societal discussions. Peggy McIntosh published White Privilege: Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack in 1989, but her reflections did not enter common public discourse until the past decade. Even though the process she describes was highly personal to her own experience, it offers clues as to how Osler could speak against prejudice while still being unable to see racism within. McIntosh's work has been groundbreaking, not because it is new, but because people heard her. Being a white woman had an impact on that. The level of awareness that white people are starting to demonstrate is very recent. Reflect upon her statement. I did not see myself as a racist because I was taught to recognize racism only in individual acts of meanness by members of my group, never in invisible systems conferring unsought racial dominance on my group from birth. This is important because while we now have the benefit of seeing that racism does not have to be a direct act of aggression, it can be built into systems, Osler did not have the benefit of being confronted by this important perspective. My sense of Osler is that he would be an ally if he were with us today. Part of what is frustrating is that in many ways he was far ahead of his peers, meaning in this case, white British men. He says things that approach our level of awareness and apologizes for hurt caused. But just as Fèvre would say that it was impossible for Rabelais to be an atheist in the 16th century, Osler could not quite escape his time. He could not see systemic racism and could not have ruminated upon the hurt it causes. Osler cannot make amends for comments he made. Our challenge is to balance recognition of the good he inspired and continues to inspire in others, while not dismissing those hurt by his words. I would argue that we need to find a new framework that accounts for our current understanding of the impact of systemic racism while preserving an honest and critical view of history. If our 21st century conversations about Osler are to be truly fruitful, I would suggest that we, perhaps ironically, channel Osler as an example, a cautionary tale, one that shines light on the power of unacknowledged racism in the structures of dominant society. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Christophe Gradman, medical historian at the University of Oslo. And I have to confess that when approached to address this meeting, I was unsure if I had anything to contribute. Indeed, what I have to say is more tangential to the matter in question today, and you may or may not find it useful. I know less about William Osler than many of you. However, I have with some intensity been involved in debates on how we should assess historical personalities, grant recognition from medical eponyms to naming institutes, or even relate to them as examples for inspiration, embodying professional, cultural, or political values that we would like to see expressed. In my case, it was all about the 19th century German physician Robert Koch. Known through his work on pathogenic bacteria, he was, not unlike Osler, much revered by his contemporaries. A whole little catalogue of eponymic expressions has survived to this day. Koch's bacillus, properly known as Mycobacterium tuberculosis, recalling his greatest discovery from 1882. Koch's postulates, embodying the methodological influence of his school. The Koch Medal, if you win it, will line your pockets with about 750,000 Canadian dollars. Finally, Koch serves as a named patron of the National Institutes of Public Health, comparable, if you may say so, to the Public Health Agency of Canada, just 100 years older, the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin. Honoring and distinction have their downsides, though. If we deem certain lives exemplary, they overshadow others, be it because they received a little attention, or if somebody else's work is actually remembered under Koch's name, elevating one person at the expense of another. Let me look at a seemingly inconspicuous example to discuss how this works and what it implies. Koch is commonly credited with having invented so-called solid culture media. They are quite important in cultivating bacteria, and Koch's laboratory pioneered the use of agar-agar. Using it, you can solidify otherwise liquid media like broth. It was, however, the wife of one of his assistants, Fanny Hesse, who suggested to transfer this piece of household technology. It comes in very handy when you're baking, to the laboratory. Interestingly, while Koch himself never claimed that invention for himself, it is commonly treated as his. It is easy to see this as minute, irrelevant detail, but depending on context that we employ and the perspective we use, it can be quite fascinating. Looking at it, we can understand relations between the kitchen, the laboratory, and gender in late 19th century science, where collaborating spouses are surprisingly common but seldom visible. Downplaying it, we are missing an important dimension of 19th century science. We also realize the problematic aspects of lionizing certain individuals who then suck up others' lives in their biographies. Judgments about the past, and this is my first point, are really judgments about the present. When we find gender relations worth considering, Fanny Hesse becomes interesting. Otherwise, the agar-agar story is a small detail, hardly changing what we think about Koch. Secondly, we realize when we speak of Koch, we often do speak not of the person, but of the persona, that is, the public image of a historical figure. And this is certainly the case for Osler alike. In both cases, the work of a small army of professionals is condensed into just one name, and what remains as a historical portrait is very dependent on what we, the observers, wish to express. There is, however, bigger fish to fry in Koch's career. His conduct of medicine at times seems quite objectionable to an early 20th century observer. Specifically, we can look at his work in tropical medicine, and in particular at his involvement in the control campaigns for sleeping sickness right after the year 1900. This condition was ravaging East Africa in the so-called Uganda epidemic. Contemporary campaigns for the control are notorious for their brutal application of ineffective treatments, their systematic suppression of local populations, while at the same time supplying colonial occupation with a medico-humanitarian gloss over. Koch himself went on several research expeditions to Africa, and one of these in 1906-1907 came to be focused on the treatment of sleeping sickness. When summarizing his work in a report to the imperial government, Koch considered future control campaigns. If deemed necessary, he advocated the isolation of sufferers in camps for compulsory treatment. In doing so, he drew some linguistic inspiration, if I may say so, from camps for civilians the British had run during the Boer War, calling them concentration camps. The terminology was probably accurate in a technical sense, relating to the compulsory isolation of civilians, but in hindsight of further histories, a disastrous choice. Last year in Germany, Koch's entanglement into the sleeping sickness control campaign triggered a debate, whereas in the documented presence of several treatment camps before World War I, where armed guards and barbed wire were standard practice, did this not make Koch untenable as a named patron of a 21st century National Institute of Public Health? I have been involved in this debate. Before I try to offer you my opinion on the matter, I would like to point your attention to the effect that would work to elevate Koch's persona when it came to agar now works against him. Much as he gets credit for a lot of lab gadgets which he did not invent, he is now criticized for sleeping sickness treatment camps he had little to do with. Of course, he authored the report that recommended to have such camps in the first place, but he did not suggest the military style in which the control of sleeping sickness became conducted later. In fact, in his own camp, which he ran on a group of islands in Lake Nyassa, before writing the report, patients were free to enter and leave as they wished. On the previous slide, you can see that there's also no barbed wire in this camp. Being outside of German East Africa, he could not have used German military for armed guards, of course. But I do think his British hosts in nearby Entebbe would have been happy to send some guards. Yet, he did not inquire for that, it seems. The treatment he used was lacking efficacy and had serious side effects. In this case, it seems fair enough to conclude that also by contemporary standards, its application should have been stopped earlier, and that it was ambition that brought him to hang on to it. Thinking of Osler, we might take a look at Koch's attitudes towards patients. Generally speaking, Koch was less interested in people than in their infections. He showed little empathy in any of his patients individually, but speaking as a biographer, this also went for those he treated in Europe. He also certainly never questioned colonial conquest and domination as such. But neither did he see himself as a member of some kind of master race. Privately, he learned Swahili to be able to talk to the island's inhabitants, and without much hesitation, fired a member of his team, because this man's snappy military-style demeanor alienated locals. More importantly, he showed no interest of putting in practice any of the suggestions laid out in his report. In fact, when returning from his sleeping sickness expedition, he was frustrated with its achievements, not the least regarding his own abandoned treatment campaign. In fact, it was the end of his career. Koch became a pensioner. In the consecutive years, colonial authorities and another generation of younger doctors went about to create a set of sleeping sickness camps in Germany's colonies. It is in these places that armed guards and barbed wire became customary, and which contributed to the image of sleeping sickness control as colonial medicine's heart of darkness. The person and the persona, the historical character and its public image, are not the same. The latter, the personae, are in fact our own creation. We are shaping them as an expression of our worldviews. And as a result, persona changes over time. Koch's experimental genius, endeared to mid-20th century doctors, is suited to raise the eyebrows of modern observers who distrust notions of geniality. Osler's humanitarianism strikes us as naive because we have taught ourselves to see blatant humanitarianism as a smokescreen for elitism practiced, for instance, by NGOs in global health. As a result, we are rewriting colonial histories in the light of recent critiques of global health. Yet the irreducible distance in political, cultural, moral horizon between the present and the past should make us careful to judge, I think. Claiming, for instance, that Koch was socially and culturally progressive, since he supported the careers of Jewish colleagues and, unusual for his days, a female microbiologist, is ahistorical and naive. It ignores his rather peculiar motives for doing so. claiming he was a racist is equally questionable. Nowhere in history will we ever find figures that embody our 21st century ideals. All we can ever achieve is a dialogue to what material has become upon us from the past, and that can help us to elaborate the traditions we want to uphold or change. Our evaluations need to be contextual, I think. They need to engage with people and their circumstances, rather than pinpointing isolated failures or achievements. The question that you have to ask yourself, which I tried to answer for Koch, is if the historical persona in question can be taken to represent professional and other values we wish to express. In Koch's case, I think the answer is still a yes. He was the discoverer of the causes of anthrax, tuberculosis, and cholera, and we still think that knowing such causes is decisive. He was a top scientist who spent almost his whole career working as a high-ranking civil servant, and I think that this embodies a notion of scientifically based public health we should applaud. It would not be difficult to draw a line from Robert Koch to what many of us expect from a director of, say, Public Health Canada or the CDC. Let me conclude with a picture I took a few years ago. We are in Tanzania's National Tuberculosis Hospital. If we stroll to the director's office, what we see are two portrait photographs. On top, the father of the nation, Julius Nyerere, Tanzania's first president. Below, the father of microbes, Robert Koch. Let me be quite clear. There are very few happy memories in Tanzania with regards to German colonial conquest. I am quite sure that nobody in the hospital thinks that somehow Koch's achievements with regards to tuberculosis exonerate for anything with regards to colonial occupation and rule. Yet, the opposite also seems to be the case. Bacteriology is not blamed for colonialism here. The picture is there, after all. As I see it, the arrangement states that there is a substantial link of a different kind. The arrangement is a claim to tradition. As long as we think that researching the causes of infectious diseases should be a ground rock of public health and medicine, we can summarize and popularize our ambitions through an image of Robert Koch. Thank you for your attention.
It's a real pleasure to be able to thank the speakers for, I think, a really stimulating panel. Certainly a lot of content, a lot of diversity, and some overlapping. And it's my pleasure. I wanted to remind people that if they have questions, you can submit them in the chat function, which is at the bottom of the bar across the Zoom. And they will be fed to me, and I will be able to ask the panelists. Before we go to the panelists and begin the speakers, the discussion section of our program, I would like to introduce with a bit more detail our distinguished panel. We began with Professor Jenna Healy. Prior to joining Queen's University as the Jason A. Hanna Chair in the History of Medicine in 2017, Professor Healy taught at Yale, where she had earlier completed her PhD in the history of science and medicine. Her research focuses on the intersection of 20th century medicine, gender, technology, and health policy. She was followed by Dr. Shamir Shaheen Hussain. He is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences at McGill and a pediatric emergency physician. Dr. Shaheen Hussain is an advocate for social justice and is the author of the acclaimed book, Fighting for a Hand to Hold, Confronting Medical Colonialism Against Indigenous Children in Canada. The French version comes out tomorrow. Congratulations. Following that, we have Dr. Naheen Tudania, is a medical registrar in Australia with a long-standing interest in medical history and William Osler. We're really lucky today to have had Dr. Andre Lemedi present. He's a graduate of the McGill Medical School who is currently completing his first year residency in pathology. Dr. Lemedi served terms on the General Council of the McGill Medical Student Society and on the University Senate. Dr. Mary Haig-Earl is head librarian of McGill's own Osler Library of the History of Medicine. She completed her PhD in the history of science and medicine at Yale and is especially interested in medical ethics as well as medieval and early modern medicine. And finally, we're really pleased to welcome Professor Christophe Gradman. He's a professor in the Department of Community Medicine and Global Health at the University of Oslo. Professor Gradman's research focuses primarily on the history of infectious diseases in modernity. His work on historiographical issues, though, looks at biographies as a special form of historical texts. So thank you very much. And again, I look forward to this discussion that follows. We have a couple questions in line. And so I'd like to start with the first. It doesn't say precisely who the question is directed to, but Anne Hepburn asks, is there any evidence of abuse of patients, Indigenous or people of color, by Dr. Osler?
I guess I can only speak to what I've seen. I haven't seen any direct evidence of any sort of action of that sort. But of course, we always keep our minds open to that. I think it's...
I would make a comment on that and say, if I got the question right, that I would say no. Not just with patients, but as I demonstrated in my presentation more generally. And I could speak more to that as this discussion ensues.
Okay.
I also am not aware of a specific incident with a patient. He did make comments about African-American patients at Hopkins being more, being patients that are more prone to venereal disease, comments about gonorrhea, things like that. But we don't have any evidence of a patient interaction.
I mean, I can chime in very quickly. I do also just want to acknowledge that I believe earlier I saw Nav Prasad, Dr. Nav Prasad and Dr. Philip Berger are here as well, who are the co-authors of the Cmaj article. So they may also wish to chime in on this. I'm not aware of any direct harm, but I guess the question ends up being, what do we mean by direct harm, right? I think as several people have said, when things become systemic, you don't need to directly cause harm yourself if the system and the culture that you're working in already does that for you. So as Professor Healy has illustrated very adequately and articulately, the professional notes that we're talking about, that was, a cultural phenomenon that persisted in McGill lore for decades. And the consequences of dehumanizing Indigenous peoples and justifying that dehumanization for decades, we can only, guess the impacts that would have on actual clinical care for Indigenous peoples to this day.
Oh, Anil, thank you very much. Maybe we can move on to the next question. We've got questions coming in, which is wonderful. We have a second question from Patricia Forbes, and again, a question I think that anybody could address as we go forward. Who will have the authority to nominate worthy individuals for society to admire? Will there always be feet of clay? It's a question I think that talks about authority and who gets to choose the heroes, and I think even suggests about why we need heroes in the way we understand the past.
I'm not really sure that we should be finding heroes. Honestly, I would be up for the let's remove as many as possible. But I do think it's important as we go forward, and certainly I'm very aware of this as a librarian, which is why I've jumped in, that we do need to think about who have we recognized in the past and why. I've been trying to help some people with even institutional and departmental histories, and so far my easy answers are all men, and so I think it's really just taking a more careful look at how our histories have been written and why, and then trying to find those people who have voices that haven't been heard. And I think it's just a matter of acknowledging that sort of work rather than necessarily looking for people or even swapping people, because it's not like the hall of medical attribution or contribution is finite. We don't need to take people out to bring people in, but we definitely need to look at how we can diversify the people who we recognize. Okay. And make sure that today's body of practitioners are represented in there. So.
can maybe add something to that. And I do think what is important is to realize that it's actually not someone who decides, it's a plural. It will be us who decide, and us as a society, or you as a Canadian society. And I don't think such debates are going to make a lot of headway if one starts them by throwing saints and villains at each other.
I might make a comment specifically about Osler. I think interesting hearing the different perspectives, but I would say that I think the historical record with regards to William Osler is particularly remarkable. I think if one considers I'd agree with Christophe that it's not any one individual that would determine, why Osler is so widely celebrated. But I think we can look at, there were like 200 obituaries when he passed away in 8 different countries, which reflects, I guess, the collective feeling of the profession. So I think that if there's such historical evidence, that should be considered. And there is this thing about whether, I do think there's value in having heroes as a medical professional. There are certain perhaps values that are useful to hold. I often quote Thomas Brown, as I like to. You guys might have noticed that although all men are created equal, there's no small inequality in their operations. So I do believe that what one does in one's life, and if it's inspirational collectively to a group of people, there is nothing wrong with upholding that individual.
Okay. Anybody else
I'd like
want
to
to
maybe
chime in?
add, I think a very concrete answer to this question is, for example, the motion that was passed by the medical students. This is a way in which the community at large expressed a will about naming and gave some suggestions, and also thoughts about the process that should be used to think about what we name and who we name things after. So in this context, I think that's a direct example of what can be done, and it clearly works because it leads to symposia like these where we have discussions.
Anybody else want to chime in on that?
I'll say I think I agree with Mary that maybe we should move our focus away from individuals. I think it obscures the way that medical knowledge is actually made, which is very rarely the contributions of one individual, but of a team of individuals. And it often allows us to overlook figures who historically have been marginalized, all the people working in the laboratory who are not necessarily the head of that laboratory. So I think we can start to think about monuments to achievement as opposed to monuments to people. The Ether Monument in Boston is a great example. It's a monument to Ether because there's a priority dispute about who first developed Ether, but it actually just now stands as a monument to scientific achievement. And I like that sentiment a lot.
Oh, okay.
Could I make an additional comment in response to these?
Certainly.
Yeah, thank you. So I think particularly, I've heard this, I guess, viewpoint before. I'm a medical biographer, so I focus on the lives of individuals who I would say that much as there are, group efforts and communal efforts, and it's true that, there are lots of people who are not remembered for various reasons. I think there's a certain ideal that is approached, particularly in the Western canon, with, how could I say, sanctifying the individual, which is not altogether misguided, because in the end of the day, these efforts and advances in society do actually rely on the individual conduct of individuals. And it does matter what an individual does. And I think that can be lost if you try to, pathologize the idea of like heroism and stuff. So that's what I think.
Okay, that's
interesting. Can I chime in? Sorry, I got kicked off the Zoom for some reason. Do you mind if I chime in just quickly?
Certainly.
I think I just caught Jenna's last comments and Nadim's comments.
Yes.
I guess one thing I would just say, and I didn't obviously get a chance to address this in my presentation just because of time, but this also speaks to, my proposal is not to like Jenna was saying, is not to rename after other individuals. There are plenty of people, who are highly regarded, who I'm sure if we dig hard enough, there's going to be stuff that we won't like about them. I mean, that's kind of, there's this line from a movie that came out last year called The Last Black Man in San Francisco, where one of the characters basically talks about an individual who's conflicted. And he basically says, people aren't just one thing. And that's the reality. People aren't just one thing. But I do think, I respectfully disagree with what was just said in terms of, I do think there's a culture a culture that we live in that prizes individualism. And that's rooted into, even to a large extent, how we understand philosophy, psychology, sociology, history. I just finished reading this book by Cedric Robinson that's called Terms of Order. And the subtitle is The Political Science and the Myth of Leadership. And what I find fascinating is that this book was written in 1980. And very few people know about it, even though it's truly a masterpiece in terms of bridging together philosophy, political science, psychology, history, sociology. It's phenomenal. But what he does is he challenges the concept in Western societies of the very notion of leadership. And says that can actually be, perhaps that's an inherent problem in our culture. And so I think that's kind of an interesting larger discussion to have that ties back to what Jenna was saying, which is that maybe we don't really need heroes. We need to know what people have done, but we don't need to worship them.
Thank you. I think that, and in some ways that I think connects to the next question. And I'm finding this very interesting because people have very different perspectives, I think partly informed by professional and disciplinary training in terms of what even words mean and what the object and the purpose of this exercise is. But Susan Kellen has asked a question, particularly for Dr. Lametti. When the McGill students voted against using Oslerisms, what exactly are they referring to? And maybe you could just talk a little bit about that context of who was involved in that motion.
So again, the motion did not call on ending the use of Oslerisms. It mostly went in the same direction as my presentation, which is to recognize that Osler's legacy at McGill is complex, and his legacy overall is complex. It's not unidimensional, and that we should not treat him in this unidimensional way. And in general, to exercise more reflection in how his name is used. So it's actually quite a long motion. It's about 3 pages. And it was vigorously debated by, over 150, 200 students who were there. So a significant part of the students. And again, I think the idea is not to, remove Osler's name from McGill, but rather to say, as an institution, history is one thing, but naming things in the present is a political decision. And how we make that decision is subject to debate and contributions of the entire community. That's really what the motion was about.
And this actually, did anyone, that was very particular about the motion, but I think building on that, I have another question that is, do we know anything about if Osler himself was involved in promoting his mythical status? Because one of the things I've learned from hearing these really interesting presentations is a really, I think, compelling argument about the historical actual man and the legacy and the myth. And I just the question is, did Osler have a role in producing that?
I can answer to that directly, and it'll be interesting to hear what the others have to say. Quite the contrary, actually. I think it's in an Alabama student at the end. Osler famously refers plenty times in his writings. Actually, in 3 weeks before he died, he marked out this quotation in his copy of Brown's Religio Medici, the 1862 Ticknor & Fields edition, which is in the Osler Library. And you can see it for yourselves that the inequity of oblivion blindly scattereth her poppy, and deals with the memory of men without distinction to merit of perpetuity. He marks it with saying this is one of his favorite quotations from Brown. He quotes that same segment, or refers to the idea, at least at the end of an Alabama student, and then quotes Matthew Arnold's Rugby Chapel, where he says that, if I remember correctly, that where most of us will be, forgotten about in history. I just want to remember the exact line is that no one asks who or what we have been more than he asks what waves in the moonlit solitudes mild of the midmost ocean have formed for a moment and gone. And Osler includes himself in that category. That's, I think, an example of how he thought. There were, of course, other instances of Osler responding to the gratitude of the profession. And actually, in the year that he died, on the eve of his 70th birthday, he explicitly attributes his success to his colleagues and to the kindness and appreciation of the people he worked with.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple more questions, and I'm really cognizant of time passing. Another question back to Dr. Lametti. How much of the student body was involved in the 2019 motion? This question estimates that there were about 730 medical students, and by what percentage was the motion passed?
I don't remember exactly. I don't think we keep track of that, but it was, overwhelming, probably above 90%. And of the people who were there, having over 30% of your student body present at a General Assembly, I think is an achievement for any group. So I do think that it does express the sincere opinion of the students.
Okay, that's helpful. Another question. If Osler were alive today, what would he think? This is a hypothetical. So since we've been guilty of presentism, I think, both in terms of thinking about the past and also giving values of the today and in layering on the past, what would Osler make of this this current situation in which he's being reviewed? Do we know anything about? Or is that just completely what if, hypothetical history?
Well, very briefly, I think he would welcome the dissection. I would like to believe he would welcome the dissection and the criticism, but I would like to see others weigh in on that.
I mean, it's an impossible question to answer.
No, it's just.
But he barely even identified as a Canadian. He very much saw himself as British. He was very, very fond of sort of colonization. I think he'd have a lot more to adjust to. I think he wouldn't even understand the terms of why what he did was offensive, because I think he did wholeheartedly sort of internalize the ethics of British colonialism and sort of the white supremacy of it.
Okay.
As I speculated in my presentation, he did say that a man should be judged by his own contemporaries. So I'm assuming that he wouldn't be too bothered by it, right? That, again, our debate today is not about the historical author, it's about present day issues and present day problems. But again, that's my personal take on that.
I have a slightly off comment to that. Of course, it's the type of question that as a historian, you don't want to answer. You feel you have to see a priest after you've done that. But with regards to Koch, I could say he would probably be very happy to lose much of his reputation because he hated it when he was alive. He was spooked by his public standing. He never got to terms with it. And so this is a type of complexity we have to take account of when we look at histories. We cannot translate a reputation that's 100 years old into what we think reputation is today very easily. And that's why historians hesitate to answer such questions.
I might add, thanks for that, Christophe. I might add, I also, I do think that I obviously have a certain perspective, as you guys will have noted, but I do think there's evidence that I think the main overriding, like Osler's dominant message, which was, as I've written, professional cohesion, I think he would be very interested in this debate. I don't think he'd be interested in this idea of the, criticizing individuals. He was particularly, charitable towards others, as I mentioned in my presentation. And I think he would encourage any discussion that would further support professional unity. And he would probably discourage certain sentiments that have been, thrown around in this debate, which I think are divisive. So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking at the clock and we are getting to the end of the period that we have. I'm just wondering if anybody feels that there was something they needed to say based on any of the questions and they didn't get a chance to fully express what was their opinion, their scholarly belief, their experience. I just wanted to give that chance open before we close.
I mean, there's one thing I took out of my presentation, if I can, Professor Morton. To me, one other question when we're trying to talk about, what Osler would have thought and how he would have reacted. I mean, part of it, I really, to be completely frank with you, I almost don't really care. But what's interesting is, the parallel I make with Franz Boas, right? These were like literally contemporaries. Like they were like pretty much, doing this at the same time as Osler was writing professional notes. Franz Boas was with the Inuit in Baffin Island, right? And so to me, that's what the other reason I was going to argue about presentism is, to me, it's actually very patronizing and paternalistic to suggest that Osler was a man of his time. Because we see with Franz Boas, who had, a similar kind of, bourgeois or elite, upbringing, who was able to transcend his own story. And Osler was not able to do that. So if Osler was a true visionary, you would expect that he would have been able to do that, but he didn't. And so I kind of feel like if Osler, was so open to criticism, then I think he would take the criticism that he's receiving now and recognize that maybe he does not warrant or merit the incredible mythology that's been built up around him.
I mean, I don't really think that anyone should be mythologized. And I think that, ironically, some of the criticisms that are going at him in some ways perpetuate that standard, that sort of deity standard, because he wasn't perfect. But, and of course, I'm now forgetting why I really wanted to say, I think it's when I've, started to look into Osler more, as I said, I'm not an expert on Osler. What I've noticed is he's extraordinarily directed. He's very focused. And this is the advice he gives to students. It's the advice that he gives to other bibliophiles. It's saying, you need to choose what you're going to focus on. And so a lot of what I'm hearing is, why didn't Osler do this? Why didn't he do that? Why wasn't he concerned with race? And the fact is, he doesn't seem to have actually been concerned with race. I think he was kind of oblivious to a lot of his own racism. And that's not an excuse, and I'm not about to do that. But I think some of the questions we're asking are sort of maybe not really understanding fully that Osler was very, if you're going to be successful, you choose what you're going to do and you do it. And he taught.
No, thank you very much. And I think, in fact, that might be a really interesting way for us to end. There's other questions I'm really sorry we didn't get to. If you'd like to, if you feel like you didn't get your chance, please contact me and I will be happy to direct it to the individual involved. I'm in the history department, easy email. So thank you very much. And thank you also for the really large group of viewers who have helped us sort of work through these really complex questions. It's hard when we're looking at the past, when we're looking at issues like mythology, when we're looking at historical evidence and trying to bring it together in some kind of meaningful way as we live in the present. So thank you very much. I deeply appreciate the Social Studies of Medicine for organizing this, and especially once again to thank the panelists for your time and really well-considered thoughts. So thank you. So I'm just gonna.
For the moderating.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.